Let's talk about South Africa and the International Criminal Court. We're joined tonight by Gruzd from the South African Institute of International Affairs and Nicole, Fritz, Director at the Helen Suzman Foundation. My thanks to you both for your time tonight. Let me start with you, Nicole. Would it really be a big deal at this point if South Africa withdrew as a signatory to the Rome Statute?
I think it would be a big deal symbolically, and I think what's clear is that we've had, clarification from the Presidency and from the ANC itself that there is no proposal on the table to withdraw. In fact, what has been clarified is that they note the decision to rescind the withdrawal. But let's assume that there was a decision to withdraw. This issue has been well litigated before our courts. Withdrawal requires a parliamentary process, which in itself will take some time. Once that process were to be accomplished and it's approved, the decision to withdraw, then such withdrawal could be communicated to the UN Secretary General, and only 12 months after the notification of withdrawal had been received by the UN Secretary General would we then be released from our obligations in terms of the International Criminal Court. And so if we're looking at the BRICS summit and the proposed participation in person of President Putin, I don't think at this point, withdrawal would have any implications for our legal obligations.
So South Africa would still, if this is a period that's going to take, let's say, a year, if it started next week, that would be until May next year. So come August, there would still be, Nicole, a legal obligation for this country to detain Putin or hand him over to ICC officials, right?
If they received a request from the International Criminal Court, and we have to assume that the International Criminal Court, knowing that if it were to believe that Putin were traveling to South Africa to attend the BRICS summit, South Africa being a party to the International Criminal Court, to the Rome Statute, a request from the International Criminal Court would then likely follow for cooperation in terms of surrender of President Putin, and in the face of such request, South Africa would be obliged to execute, to follow through with that request.
Stephen, how difficult a position is this for South Africa legally when you take the fact that the ANC is back to a discussion around wanting, Nomvula Mkhwanyane is suggesting reforms within the ICC, but another school of thought in the party says withdraw altogether as a signatory?
So I think what we're seeing is some of the confusion that has been raging within the ANC for many, many years. As Nicole said, we have a precedent for this. In 2015, Omar al-Bashir of Sudan was wanted by the International Criminal Court. He came to South Africa for an AU summit. We were obliged to arrest him. We didn't do so. There was a court case which obliged us to arrest him, and we actually assisted him to leave the country. So this now assumes greater proportions and greater importance, because what if South Africa was seen to be a serial offender of not upholding its own laws and international laws? So I think we're seeing these different forces at work within the ANC. I think it was embarrassing for the president to say that we're going to pull out, and then a few hours later his office and his party contradicting that and saying no, we're not going to pull out. And as Nicole says, it wouldn't make much of an effect on August's meeting of the BRICS.
But why is it even important, Stephen, at this point for a country like South Africa to be a signatory when you consider the many criticism of the ICC and how it's worked? It's been accused of an application, a selective application of justice, where most of the people who've come before the court are from African states, and, for example, the likes of America are not even signatories, yet they speak quite often about international justice.
Yeah, I mean, we mustn't forget that it's a court of last resort. If litigants are not able to get what they believe is justice in the national court system, it can be elevated to the International Criminal Court, which takes a very serious view on crimes like crimes against humanity, genocide, the crime of aggression, etc., war crimes. And, if we believe in justice, I think it is very important to be part of this court. Yes, it has been accused of selective prosecution, but as I say, most of the cases that were referred to it by nationals of those particular countries. And, but the other strange quirk of this court is that the UN Security Council can refer cases to it. And as you rightly point out, the US and China and Russia, who are permanent members of the UN Security Council, are not signatories to the Rome Statute and are not members of the court. But for political reasons, cases can be referred by that Security Council to the court for investigation.
So, Nicole, then what would be the consequences if South Africa failed for a second time to detain a high-profile wanted leader of a country?
Well, I honestly don't think that there are any advisors, either in the South African government or in Moscow, who are going to suggest that as matters stand, President Putin attends the BRICS summit in South Africa. Even if he were to get an ironclad assurance from the South African executive that he wasn't to face any arrest or surrender to the ICC, our courts are independent institutions. As Steve has already referred to our previous example involving Omar al-Bashir, there the courts ordered an arrest warrant. Obviously, in that case, he was facilitated in his escape from South Africa. But the idea that President Putin will be sort of spirited out of the country, forced to sort of hide in his jet on the runway, waiting to be spirited out of the country, I think just has too many negative implications for Moscow, for Russia, for the strength that they want to project. And so sort of outside of the legal conundrum, I don't think that that's going to happen. If, though, in this kind of parallel universe, that is a situation which we're facing, where the courts for a second time are blatantly ignored by the executive, well, then we have another constitutional crisis. And I think the costs for South Africa's standing on the world stage and domestically will be enormous.
And Stephen, surely even Moscow and the Kremlin, with its bravado, would not want the risk of such a diplomatic incident unfolding in a friendly country where their head of state would want to come here to attend a summit as part of the BRICS leadership, only to have the complication of a possible detention.
Yes, again, it would be very embarrassing, not to mention dangerous. So he hasn't traveled much. He hasn't really been out of Europe. He's traveled to, I think, some of the former Soviet states, but he hasn't traveled so far. And I think he's very cautious. I mean, he could relieve a headache for the South African government tomorrow by saying, I'm not going to come. I'll join virtually, or I'll send my prime minister, or I'll send Minister Lavrov, and I'll join you guys online. He hasn't done that, but, the Kremlin also hasn't said for sure that he is going to come. So I think there's going to be a lot of politics up and down in the next few weeks and months in the run-up to it. And I think it's sad because it's going to detract from the good things that South Africa wants to project from that summit. Everything's going to be about Putin and the arrest warrant.
Mm-hmm. And so, Nicole, what then becomes the alternative? If, let's say, South Africa joins I think it was the Gambia that previously withdrew, and Burundi as signatories to the Rome Statute, is there room here legally, perhaps, for the establishment of a similar body, but one that would be seized with continental issues, continental or crimes committed on the continent, you think?
Well, there is the proposed Malabo statute. I mean, that's a long way off from being actually instantiated and implemented. I mean, I should say, right, I mean, what is entirely conceivable for South Africa to do here is what it did for many years in the past relating to al-Bashir before this sort of fiasco in 2015, where it simply communicated to al-Bashir, despite the fact that he was invited to attend President Zuma's inauguration and invited to attend the World Cup soccer, that really it was in this sort of diplomatic conundrum that it couldn't speak to the courts and that it was safer for all concerned that he just stay away. And one has to hope that South Africa is going to take a similar approach here, that it will be diplomatically communicated to Russian counterparts that is the course of action that should be adopted, and that, as Steve has indicated, either Putin will attend virtually or he will have one of his counterparts, like Sergei Lavrov, represent him at the BRICS summit in South Africa, which they would then be perfectly entitled to do, facing no prospect of arrest. And I think that is much more likely than South Africa resigning from the International Criminal Court. And I think one of the other important considerations to keep in mind is that South Africa was one of the chief architects of the Rome Statute in the ICC. It was one of the first times, sort of post-democratic South Africa, where South Africa was offered the opportunity to help remake the global order. It was always aware that it was going to be deeply complicated and fraught. From the get-go, it was clear that some of the most powerful states, like the United States, were going to stay outside of the ambit of the court. But South Africa was very clear that it wanted to play this role, and its sustained critical engagement was going to help it sort of bring about more, greater equality and justice on the world stage.
And Stephen,
and what's interesting, right?
Mm-hmm. And just lastly, Stephen, I know I'm asking you to do a bit of crystal gazing here, but do you see a scenario in which Vladimir Putin would ever appear before the International Criminal Court as an accused person at this stage?
Well, I don't think he's going to go to the nearest police station and give himself up. But, and as long as he stays in Russia, I don't think he can be forcibly arrested. But it's very unlikely. Also, this war is going to end, as all wars end, with some kind of negotiation. And I think having this charge against him makes it much, much more difficult to get him around the table when that point comes. And I don't think that point has come in the war yet. I don't know. It's very unlikely that we will see him in the dock in The Hague at the International Criminal Court.
Stephen Gruzd from the South African Institute of International Affairs, and Nicole Fritz, Director at the Helen Suzman Foundation. My thanks to you both for your time today. Thank you very much for being on the program.